In 1999, road workers cutting through a mound of rubble and ancient debris near the village of Lomas de Tacamichapa in the Mexican state of Veracruz pulled a stone block from the earth. It was small, roughly 36 centimeters long, 21 centimeters wide, and 13 centimeters thick, about the size of a large brick. Its surface was smooth and slightly convex, worn by centuries of contact with soil and water, and it was covered, on its flattest face, with 62 symbols arranged in neat horizontal rows, separated by what appeared to be dividing lines etched into the stone. The worker set it aside. They were building a road, not excavating a ruin. The block sat unexamined for several years before it came to the attention of archaeologists, who recognized it as something extraordinary. In 2006, a team led by the Mexican archaeologist Maria del Carmen Rodriguez Martinez and the epigrapher Stephen Houston published a study of the block in the journal Science that sent a shockwave through the fields of archaeology, epigraphy, and the history of writing. The block, now known as the Cascajal Block, bore what appeared to be the oldest writing in the Americas. The symbols did not match any known Mesoamerican script. They were not Mayan. They were not Zapotec. They were not Mixtec or Aztec or Isthmian. They were something older, something that predated every previously known writing system in the Western Hemisphere by centuries. Radiocarbon dating of the archaeological context in which the block was found placed it in the early first millennium before the Common Era, roughly 900 before the Common Era, give or take a century. If the dating is correct, the Cascajal Block is approximately 3,000 years old, and the civilization that produced it was not some obscure, forgotten culture. It was the Olmec, the oldest major civilization in Mesoamerica, the people who carved the colossal stone heads that stare from the jungles of southern Mexico with expressions of power and inscrutable calm. The civilization that Mesoamerican scholars have called, for over half a century, the mother culture of all the great civilizations that followed. The Olmec invented writing in the Americas, or so the Cascajal Block suggests. And then, over the centuries that followed, the Olmec civilization declined, its cities were abandoned, its monuments were defaced or buried, and its writing system, the oldest in the hemisphere, the ancestor or precursor of every subsequent Mesoamerican script, vanished. Not gradually, through the slow processes of linguistic change that consumed Linear A or the Minoan language, not suddenly, through the violent destruction that silenced Rongorongo, but completely, so completely that when the great Maya civilization developed its own magnificent writing system centuries later, no trace of the Olmec script survived in any readable form. The daughter script flourished. The mother script was forgotten. The numbers are striking. The Cascajal Block contains 62 symbols using 28 distinct signs. It is the only object of its kind ever found. No other inscription in the Olmec script has been confirmed with certainty. The entire known corpus of the earliest writing system in the Americas consists of a single block of serpentine, smaller than a shoebox, bearing fewer signs than a modern tweet. Everything we know, or think we know, about the origins of writing in the Western Hemisphere rests on this one object and on the scattered, disputed, fragmentary evidence of Olmec symbolic expression found on a handful of other artifacts across southern Mexico. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand what the Olmec script was, why it matters, what happened to it, and why its loss represents one of the most significant gaps in our understanding of how human civilization develops. You are going to learn about a writing system that may have been the seed from which every other Mesoamerican script grew. Maya, Zapotec, Mixtec, Aztec, and that was lost so thoroughly that its very existence was unknown until a road crew stumbled upon a carved stone in a pile of rubble at the turn of the 21st century. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin. The story of the Olmec script begins in the swamps. The Gulf Coast lowlands of southern Mexico, the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, are among the most inhospitable landscapes in the Americas. Hot, humid, and prone to catastrophic flooding during the rainy season, they are laced with rivers, dotted with swamps, and covered with dense tropical vegetation that, in the absence of human intervention, swallows every clearing within a few years. The region receives over 3,000 millimeters of rainfall annually, more than twice the amount that falls on London. The temperature rarely drops below 25 degrees. The air is thick with moisture, insects, and the organic richness of a landscape that is, by any measure, one of the most biologically productive and most physically demanding environments in the Western Hemisphere. It was here, in this unlikely setting, that the first complex civilization in the Americas emerged, the Olmec, a name derived from the Aztec word for rubber people, a reference to the rubber trees that grow in the region, flourished from roughly 1500 to 400 before the Common Era. They were not the first people to inhabit the Gulf Coast lowlands. Human populations had lived in the region for thousands of years before the Olmec, practicing agriculture, fishing, and hunting in the rich alluvial environments of the river systems. But the Olmec were the first to develop the suite of features that archaeologists associate with complex civilization: monumental architecture, large-scale public works, long-distance trade networks, a stratified social hierarchy, sophisticated artistic traditions, and, if the evidence is read correctly, writing. The Olmec heartland centered on three major sites: San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. San Lorenzo, the earliest of the three, was established around 1500 before the Common Era, and reached its peak between 1200 and 900 before the Common Era. It was built on a natural plateau that had been artificially modified, shaped, terraced, and sculpted by human labour into a massive earthen platform rising above the surrounding floodplain. The engineering required to transform this natural landform into a habitable, defensible, and symbolically imposing platform was extraordinary. The Olmec moved millions of cubic meters of earth, created sophisticated drainage systems using buried channels of basalt blocks, and constructed a network of raised causeways, plazas, and mound complexes that made San Lorenzo one of the largest and most impressive settlements in the Americas at the time of its construction. The sheer scale of San Lorenzo's construction implies a level of social organization that was unprecedented in the Americas. The site covers roughly 700 hectares, an area comparable to a small modern city. The earthen platform on which the settlement was built rises over 50 meters above the surrounding floodplain at its highest point. The drainage system, consisting of buried channels lined with fitted basalt blocks, some of which weigh several hundred kilograms each, extends for hundreds of meters beneath surface, and was clearly designed by engineers with a sophisticated understanding of hydraulics. The basalt used in the drainage system was quarried in the Tuxtla Mountains, roughly 80 kilometers away, and transported to the site, the same source that provided the stone for the colossal heads. The logistical demands of quarrying, transporting, and installing these materials were enormous, and they imply the existence of a centralized authority capable of planning and executing large-scale engineering projects over extended periods. The trade networks of the Olmec were equally impressive. Olmec-style artifacts have been found across a vast area of Mesoamerica, from the highlands of central Mexico to the Pacific coast of Guatemala, from the Balsas River Basin to the Yucatan Peninsula. The Olmec traded in jade, obsidian, magnetite, serpentine, and other valuable materials, obtaining them from sources hundreds of kilometers from the heartland, and distributing finished goods across a network that spanned thousands of square kilometers. The presence of Olmec-style objects at distant sites, including jade figurines, ceramic vessels, and stone sculptures bearing Olmec iconography, has been interpreted as evidence of both commercial exchange and cultural influence. The Olmec were not merely producing goods for local consumption. They were exporting a cultural package, an iconographic and symbolic system that other societies adopted, adapted, and made their own. This cultural package, sometimes called the Olmec horizon, included a set of recurring motifs and symbols that appear consistently across the Olmec world. The word jaguar, a composite human-feline figure that may represent a deity or a mythological ancestor. The feathered serpent, which would become one of the most important deities in later Mesoamerican religion. The crossed bands motif, which which appears to represent the sky or the cosmos, and the maize god, a figure associated with agricultural fertility and the cycle of death and rebirth. These motifs are not random decorations. They are elements of a coherent symbolic system, a visual language that encoded specific ideas about the nature of the cosmos, the source of political authority, and the relationship between the human and the divine. The coherence and consistency of this symbolic system, its use of specific motifs in specific contexts, its adherence to identifiable iconographic conventions, its transmission across vast distances without significant degradation, is itself evidence of a sophisticated communicative tradition. The Olmec were not merely making pictures. They were encoding information in a standardized, transmissible, culturally shared symbolic system. The question is whether this system included a component that functioned as writing, a component that recorded not just ideas and images, but the specific words and sounds of the Olmec language. The evidence for such a component comes from several sources beyond the Cascajal Block. The most important is the so-called Epi-Olmec script, a writing system that appeared in the Olmec heartland several centuries after the decline of the major Olmec centers, and that is represented by a small number of inscriptions, most notably the La Mohara stela and the Tuxtla statuette. The La Mohara stela is a large basalt monument discovered in 1986 in the Acala River near the town of La Mohara in Veracruz. It bears a lengthy inscription of approximately 535 glyphs in what appears to be a fully developed writing system, a system with a large sign inventory, consistent rules of combination, and apparent calendrical content. The stela also bears 2 dates in the Mesoamerican long count calendar, a sophisticated system of date reckoning that was used by the Maya and other Mesoamerican civilizations, and that, according to the dates on the stela, places the inscription in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The Epi-Olmec script, the script of the La Mohara stela, is distinct from both the Olmec script of the Cascajal Block and the Maya script that flourished in the lowlands to the east. Its signs do not closely resemble either Olmec or Maya glyphs. Its calendrical system uses the long count, which was shared across Mesoamerica, but which was independently adapted by different cultures. Its language has been tentatively identified by the linguist John Justison and the epigrapher Terence Kaufman as a pre-Proto-Zocean language, a member of the Mixtecs language family, which is widely believed to be the language family of the Olmec themselves. The Justison-Kaufman decipherment of the Epi-Olmec script, published in 1993, was one of the most celebrated and most contested epigraphic achievements of the late 20th century. Justison and Kaufman argued that they had identified the phonetic values of a significant number of Epi-Olmec signs, and that they could read portions of the La Mohara text as narratives about political events, installations of rulers, military victories, and ritual performances. Their readings were detailed, internally consistent, and linguistically sophisticated. They were also challenged almost immediately. The Mayanist Stephen Houston and the linguist Michael Coe published critiques arguing that the Justison-Kaufman readings were too flexible, that the method allowed too many possible sign values, and that the resulting readings could be adjusted to fit almost any hypothesis. The debate became one of the most heated in Mesoamerican epigraphy, and it has not been definitively resolved. The Justison-Kaufman decipherment has supporters and detractors in roughly equal numbers, and the status of the Epi-Olmec script remains uncertain, partially deciphered according to some scholars, essentially undeciphered according to others. The connection between the Epi-Olmec script and the Olmec script of the Cascajal Block is, if anything, even more uncertain. The two scripts are separated by roughly 700 to 1,000 years. Their sign inventories do not obviously overlap. Their formats are different. The Cascajal Block is a small flat stone with signs arranged in rows, while the La Mohara stela is a large monument with signs arranged in columns. If the Epi-Olmec script is a descendant of the Cascajal Block script, if the writing tradition was continuous across the centuries that separate them, then the tradition underwent such dramatic changes in format, sign inventory, and organizational principles that the continuity is invisible to modern analysis. If the two scripts are unrelated, if the Epi-Olmec script was an independent development, not a descendant of the Cascajal Block tradition, then the Olmec heartland produced two separate writing traditions, each of which was eventually lost. Either possibility is extraordinary, either possibility is untestable with the current evidence, and both possibilities contribute to the overarching problem. The Olmec contribution to the history of writing in the Americas is, at present, more hypothesis than fact, a reconstruction built on fragments so small and so scattered that the reconstruction may bear little resemblance to the reality it purports to describe. And then there are the heads. The colossal stone heads are the most famous artifacts of the Olmec civilization. Massive basalt sculptures carved in the round, depicting human heads with broad, flat noses, thick lips, and distinctive helmet-like headdresses. 17 have been found across the Olmec heartland, ranging in height from roughly 1.5 meters to over 3 meters, and in weight from 6 to 50 metric tons. The basalt from which they were carved was quarried in the Tuxtla Mountains, roughly 80 kilometers from San Lorenzo, and transported to the site by a combination of river rafting and overland hauling, a logistical achievement that required the coordinated labor of hundreds or thousands of workers over weeks or months. The heads are portraits. Each one is distinct. The features, the expression, the details of the headdress differ from head to head, indicating that each sculpture represents a specific individual. The prevailing interpretation is that they depict Olmec rulers, that they are royal portraits, carved to commemorate the power and authority of the kings who governed the Olmec polities. If this interpretation is correct, the heads represent the earliest known royal portrait tradition in the Americas, a tradition of monumental self-representation that would continue in various forms throughout the subsequent history of Mesoamerican civilization. The heads are also evidence of a level of social organization and political authority that is difficult to achieve without some form of record-keeping. Mobilizing the labor force required to quarry, transport, and carve a 50-ton basalt boulder, and doing so repeatedly for at least 17 separate sculptures, implies a centralized authority capable of commanding and coordinating large numbers of workers over extended periods. In other civilizations that have achieved this level of organization, Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, the administration of labor, resources, and tribute was managed through written records. The question of whether the Olmec had a similar capability has been debated for decades. The evidence for Olmec writing comes in several forms, and each form is more ambiguous and more contested than the last. The Cascajal Block is the most dramatic and the most widely accepted, but it is not the only candidate. The bar and dot numerical system is perhaps the most significant piece of evidence for Olmec proto-literate capability outside the Cascajal Block itself. The bar and dot system, in which a dot represents the value 1 and a horizontal bar represents the value 5, became the standard numerical notation throughout Mesoamerica, used by the Maya, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, and virtually every other literate Mesoamerican culture. The earliest examples of bar and dot numerals have been found in contexts associated with the late Olmec period, particularly at the site of Tres Zapotes, where a fragmentary stela known as Stela C bears a long count date in bar and dot notation that has been read as 31 before the Common Era, one of the earliest long count dates ever found. The attribution of the bar and dot system to the Olmec is not universally accepted. Some scholars argue that the system originated with the Zapotec or with another highland culture and was adopted by the Gulf Coast cultures only later. The dating of the earliest examples is contested, and the question of priority, who used the system first, depends on which dates are accepted and how the archaeological contexts are interpreted. But the presence of bar and dot numerals in late Olmec contexts is well established, and the system's widespread adoption across Mesoamerica in cultures that were otherwise quite different in their artistic, linguistic, and political traditions strongly suggests a single origin point from which the system diffused. The Olmec heartland is the most geographically central and chronologically plausible candidate for that origin point. The significance of the bar and dot system extends beyond its function as a numerical notation. in every Mesoamerican culture that used it. The bar and dot system was closely integrated with the writing system. Bar and dot numerals appeared alongside glyphic texts, providing calendrical dates, recording tribute amounts, and marking the numerical values associated with names, titles, and events. The system was not a standalone technology. It was a component of a broader literate tradition. If the Olmec developed the bar and dot system, they were developing a component of writing, a piece of the puzzle that in later cultures was assembled into a complete writing system. Other evidence for Olmec symbolic activity includes inscriptions on jade celts, small, polished axe-head-shaped objects made of jade or other greenstone, which were among the most highly valued prestige goods in the Olmec world. Several jade celts from the Olmec heartland bear what appear to be incised signs, symbols that are too complex and too consistently formed to be simple tool marks and that appear to represent intentional communication. The Humboldt celt, named after the naturalist Alexander von Humboldt, who acquired it in the early 19th century, bears a series of incised signs that some scholars have interpreted as a short text, possibly a name glyph or a dedicatory inscription. The interpretation of the Celt inscriptions as writing is, however, heavily disputed. The signs are few, most celts bear only 2 or 3, and they could represent names, dates, ownership marks, or purely symbolic motifs. The line between a name glyph and a decorative emblem is, in the absence of a readable script, impossible to draw with confidence. The celts, like the Cascajal Block, provide evidence that is consistent with writing, but that falls short of proof. The ceramic vessels of the Olmec period provide yet another category of evidence. Several Olmec-style ceramic vessels bear incised or painted symbols that some scholars have interpreted as proto-writing, early, experimental forms of symbolic notation that may represent an intermediate stage between pictorial art and true writing. The symbols include geometric shapes, animal figures, and what appear to be abbreviated versions of the more elaborate iconographic motifs found on Olmec sculptures and jade objects. Their significance is debated. Are they writing, proto-writing, or decoration? And the debate is unlikely to be resolved without the discovery of additional, more extensive inscriptions. Olmec-style symbols, signs that appear to represent concepts, words, or sounds rather than purely decorative motifs, have been identified on a variety of Olmec artifacts, including jade celts, ceramic vessels, stone monuments, and the surface of the colossal heads themselves. These symbols include what appear to be calendrical notations, specifically, signs that some scholars have identified as early forms of the bar and dot numerical system that would become standard throughout Mesoamerica, and what appear to be name glyphs or title glyphs associated with depicted individuals. The interpretation of these symbols as writing, as opposed to symbolic art, heraldic emblems, or decorative motifs, is the central debate in Olmec epigraphy. The line between writing and non-writing symbolic expression is not always clear, and the Olmec evidence falls squarely in the ambiguous zone. A carving of a human figure accompanied by a set of symbols might represent a named individual, in which case the symbols are name glyphs and constitute writing, or it might represent a generic figure accompanied by decorative or symbolic elements that convey meaning without encoding language. The distinction is crucial but difficult to establish without the ability to read the symbols. The Cascajal Block pushed the debate in a new direction because it appeared to present text, and only text, unlike the symbols found on Olmec sculptures and ritual objects, which are embedded in pictorial compositions and could be interpreted as elements of visual art rather than as independent linguistic signs. The signs on the Cascajal Block are arranged in horizontal rows without any accompanying imagery. The format is textual. It looks like a page of writing, not like a decorated object. The signs are organized into what appear to be sequences, groups of symbols that follow consistent patterns of arrangement, with certain signs appearing repeatedly, and certain combinations recurring across different rows. The overall visual impression is strikingly similar to that of a text in a known writing system, organized, systematic, and clearly intended to convey information through the sequential arrangement of discrete signs. The individual signs on the block deserve detailed description because their character provides the only clues to the nature of the system. Several signs are clearly pictographic. They depict recognizable objects from the natural or cultural world. One sign appears to represent a bee or a similar flying insect. Another appears to represent a maize cob, one of the most important food plants in Mesoamerica and a symbol that carried enormous cultural and religious significance throughout the region. Another appears to represent a fish. Another appears to depict some kind of vessel or container. Still others are more abstract. Geometric shapes, crossed lines, and composite forms that do not correspond to any easily identifiable object. The mixture of pictographic and abstract signs is characteristic of writing systems that have evolved beyond the purely pictographic stage. In the early stages of writing system development, as seen in the earliest Sumerian pictographs or the earliest Chinese oracle bone inscriptions, most signs are recognizably pictorial. As the system develops and becomes more efficient, many signs undergo a process of abstraction. They lose their pictorial detail and become simplified, stylized forms. The Cascajal Block's mixture of pictographic and abstract signs could indicate a writing system in transition, one that has moved beyond pure picture writing, but that has not yet fully abandoned its pictographic origins. This developmental interpretation is, however, based on assumptions about the block's place in a developmental sequence that may not be correct. One particularly intriguing feature is the apparent presence of what the publishing team called sign group pairings, instances in which two or more signs appear together in the same combination on different lines of the text. The team identified at least 6 such pairings. These recurring combinations are among the strongest arguments for the linguistic character of the text because they suggest the presence of words, fixed combinations of signs that represent specific units of meaning and that are reused in different contexts. A purely decorative or random arrangement of signs would not be expected to produce recurring combinations at this frequency. The recurring sign groups have been compared, by some scholars, to the name and title compounds found in later Mesoamerican inscriptions, combinations of glyphs that identify specific individuals by their personal name and their office or lineage. If the Cascajal Block's recurring groups are name and title compounds, then the block may be a list of names, a roster of individuals, perhaps political or religious leaders, whose identities were recorded for ceremonial or administrative purposes. This interpretation is consistent with the format of the text, a list of items arranged in rows, and with the known uses of early writing in other civilizations. But the interpretation is, once again, speculative. The recurring groups might represent names, repeated phrases, calendrical units, or something entirely different. Without comparative evidence, every interpretation is a guess. The epigrapher David Stewart, who is one of the foremost Maya decipherers in the world, has emphasized the significance of the Cascajal Block while acknowledging its limitations. Even if we cannot read it, Stewart has said, the block tells us something important. It tells us that someone in the Olmec world around 3,000 years ago was arranging symbols in a linear sequence with repeating elements and consistent formatting. That is not decoration. That is communication. Whether it is writing in the full linguistic sense, whether it records the sounds and grammar of a spoken language, we cannot say. But it is a step toward writing, and the step was taken earlier and in a more unexpected place than anyone had imagined. The publication of the Cascajal Block in 2006 was met with both excitement and skepticism. The excitement was warranted. If the block is what it appears to be, it is the earliest known example of writing in the Western Hemisphere, predating the earliest confirmed Maya inscriptions by several centuries and the earliest confirmed Zapotec inscriptions by at least a century. The skepticism was also warranted. The block was found out of archaeological context, removed from its original setting by road construction, and its dating is based on the associated materials found in the same rubble deposit rather than on a secure stratigraphic position. Some scholars have questioned whether the block was truly associated with the materials that provide its date, or whether it might have been displaced from a different context, possibly a later one. The archaeologist David Grove, a leading authority on Olmec culture, expressed cautious support for the block's significance while noting the limitations of its provenance. The Cascajal Block is an extraordinary object, Grove observed, but extraordinary objects require extraordinary evidence. The block was found in a secondary deposit, not in its original position. Its association with early Olmec materials is probable but not certain. Until a second example is found in a secure context, the block remains a tantalizing possibility rather than a confirmed fact. Grove's caution reflects a broader principle in Olmec studies: the chronic shortage of well-provenienced evidence. The Olmec heartland is an active agricultural zone, and much of the archaeological landscape has been disturbed by centuries of farming, logging, and construction. Artifacts are frequently displaced from their original contexts by ploughing, flooding, and erosion. The tropical climate accelerates the decay of organic materials, destroying the wooden, textile, and bark paper objects that in drier climates might have preserved additional evidence of writing. The Olmec may have produced thousands of inscribed objects over the course of their civilization. The archaeological record has preserved a handful, and even that handful is compromised by the environmental and human processes that have reshuffled the evidence over 3,000 years. The question of Olmec is also inseparable from the question of Olmec influence. The Olmec are often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, a designation that implies that the fundamental cultural innovations of Mesoamerican civilization, monumental architecture, complex religion, long-distance trade, calendrical systems, and writing originated with the Olmec and were transmitted, directly or indirectly, to the later civilizations that built upon their achievements. This mother culture hypothesis was first proposed in the 1940s by the archaeologist Matthew Stirling and was developed by subsequent scholars, including Michael Coe, who became its most prominent advocate. The hypothesis has been challenged most vigorously by the archaeologist Kent Flannery and the Waxacan specialist Joyce Marcus, who argue that the development of complex civilization in Mesoamerica was a multi-regional process, that the Olmec were one of several early complex societies that developed independently and that influenced each other through networks of trade and cultural exchange. In this view, the Olmec were not the mother of Mesoamerican civilization, but one of its sisters, a major early center of cultural innovation that contributed to, but did not single-handedly originate, the broader Mesoamerican cultural tradition. The debate has direct implications for the history of writing. If the Olmec were the mother culture, then the Cascajal Block may represent the original invention of writing in the Americas, the seed from which all subsequent Mesoamerican scripts grew. If the Olmec were one of several independent centers of cultural innovation, then the Cascajal Block may represent an early experiment in writing that was parallel to, rather than ancestral to, the later scripts of the Maya and the Zapotec. The difference matters enormously for how we understand the loss of the Olmec script. If the Olmec script was the ancestor of all Mesoamerican writing, then its loss represents the destruction of a foundational document, the first chapter of a story that continued for 2 millennia. If it was an independent experiment, then its loss is a separate and perhaps even more tragic event, the extinguishing of a unique tradition that left no descendants. The evidence does not decisively settle this question. The Cascajal Block's signs do not closely resemble the signs of any later Mesoamerican script. They do not look like early Maya glyphs. They do not look like the bar and dot numerals that became standard across Mesoamerica. They do not look like the signs of the Zapotec or Isthmian scripts. If the Olmec script was the ancestor of these later systems, the ancestral relationship is not visible in the sign forms, either because the signs change beyond recognition over centuries of evolution, or because the relationship was one of concept rather than form. The Olmec may have invented the idea of writing in the Americas, without transmitting the specific signs they used. Later cultures may have been inspired by the Olmec example to develop their own scripts that encoded their own languages using their own sign inventories, without directly copying the Olmec system. This conceptual inheritance, the transmission of the idea of writing without the transmission of the specific script, is known as stimulus diffusion, and it has been proposed as the mechanism by which writing spread across Mesoamerica from its Olmec origins. The concept is plausible but difficult to prove. How do you demonstrate that one culture inspired another to invent writing, when the only evidence of the inspiration, the original Olmec script, consists of 62 signs on a single stone block? The third major Olmec center, Tres Zapotes, provides a crucial bridge between the Olmec world and the later Mesoamerican traditions. Tres Zapotes, located in the western portion of the Olmec heartland, persisted longer than either San Lorenzo or La Venta. It was occupied from at least 1000 before the Common Era to well into the first centuries of the Common Era, spanning the transition from the Olmec period to the Epi-Olmec period. It is at Tres Zapotes that the earliest long count dates have been found. Calendrical inscriptions that use the sophisticated Mesoamerican system of recording dates by counting the number of days elapsed since a fixed starting point in a notation based on units of 20s and 360s. The long count system would become one of the defining intellectual achievements of Mesoamerican civilization. The calendar that allowed the Maya to date events with a precision that was not matched in Europe until the adoption of the Julian calendar. The presence of long count dates at Tres Zapotes is significant for the history of writing. Because the long count is inherently a notational system, a way of recording numerical information using a fixed set of symbols arranged according to specific positional rules. It is, in other words, a form of writing, not a writing system in the full sense of recording continuous speech, but a specialized notation that records specific categories of information with precision and consistency. The development of the long count at an Olmec-related site suggests that the Olmec heartland was the birthplace not only of symbolic art and calendrical computation, but also of the notational conventions that would later be integrated into full writing systems by the Maya and other cultures. The connection between the long count and the Olmec script of the Cascajal Block is uncertain. The Cascajal Block does not appear to contain long count notation. Its signs are different from the bar and dot numerals used in the long count, and there is no obvious calendrical content. This might mean that the Cascajal Block predates the development of the long count, that it represents an earlier stage of Olmec symbolic development before the calendrical system was formalized. Or it might mean that the Cascajal Block records a different type of content, perhaps non-calendrical, using a different set of signs. The two systems, the Cascajal Block script and the long count notation, might be parallel developments within the broader Olmec symbolic tradition, each serving a different purpose and using a different set of conventions. The coexistence of multiple symbolic systems within a single cultural tradition is not unusual. Many literate civilizations have maintained separate notation systems for different purposes: numerical notation for counting, calendrical notation for dating, linguistic notation for recording speech, musical notation for recording music. The Olmec heartland may have produced multiple symbolic systems, each specialized for a different purpose, each with its own sign inventory and its own rules of combination. The Cascajal Block may represent one such system. The long count may represent another. The proto-writing elements identified by Carl Taube on Olmec sculptures may represent yet another. The full picture of Olmec symbolic activity may be not a single script, but a family of related but distinct systems. A symbolic ecology, if you will, in which different media served different communicative functions. This possibility, that the Olmec developed not a single writing system, but a suite of interrelated symbolic systems, complicates the question of what was lost when the Olmec civilization declined. If the Olmec had a single script that was the ancestor of all Mesoamerican writing, then the loss of that script is the loss of a single root. If the Olmec had multiple symbolic systems, then the loss is more complex. The loss of an entire ecosystem of symbolic practices, some of which may have been ancestral to later developments, some of which may have been unique to the Olmec, and lost entirely when their civilization ended. The answer, of course, is that you cannot. The evidence is insufficient. The Cascajal Block is a landmark discovery, but it is a lonely landmark, a single signpost in a vast empty landscape, pointing in a direction that cannot be confirmed. The core problem of the Olmec script is not merely that it cannot be read. It is that the evidence for its existence is so thin, so fragmentary, and so contested that the fundamental questions: was there an Olmec script? What kind of writing system was it? How was it related to later Mesoamerican scripts? Remain open after decades of scholarship. The Olmec script is not, like Linear A or the Indus Valley script, an undeciphered writing system with a substantial corpus of inscriptions awaiting analysis. It is a hypothesized writing system, supported by a single confirmed inscription and a scattering of disputed evidence, whose very reality is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. This uncertainty distinguishes the Olmec script from every other undeciphered script discussed in this series. Linear A is undeciphered but undeniably real. 1,500 inscriptions attest to its existence. The Indus Valley script is disputed in its classification, but not in its existence. 4,000 inscribed objects to prove that something was being written. The Phaistos disc is unique but unquestionably inscribed with a systematic set of signs. The Olmec script, by contrast, rests on the thinnest possible foundation: one block of stone, 62 signs, 28 distinct symbols, and a dating that is probable but not certain. The consequences of this thinness are severe. Every standard method of script analysis requires a corpus, a body of text large enough to support statistical analysis, pattern recognition, and structural inference. The Cascajal Block provides a corpus of 62 signs. This is not merely small, it is below the threshold at which any form of meaningful analysis can begin. You cannot determine the type of writing system from 28 distinct signs. The number is consistent with an alphabet, a small syllabary, or the core sign inventory of a logosyllabic system, augmented by additional signs that do not appear on this particular text. You cannot establish the direction of reading from a single short text. The signs on the Cascajal Block are arranged in horizontal rows, but whether they read left to right to left, or in some other pattern cannot be determined from internal evidence alone. You cannot identify word boundaries, grammatical structures, or semantic categories from 62 signs, arranged in a format that provides no clear indication of how the signs group into larger units. The Cascajal Block is, in informational terms, even more impoverished than the Phaistos disc, which, with its 242 signs, is already considered undecipherable from internal evidence. The Cascajal Block contains roughly 1/4 as much text as the Phaistos disc. If the disc is below the threshold for decipherment, the block is below the threshold for meaningful analysis of any kind. This does not mean that no observations can be made. The team that published the block in 2006 identified several features that they argued were consistent with a true writing system, rather than a collection of decorative motifs or non-linguistic symbols. First, the signs are arranged in a consistent left-to-right, top-to-bottom format, a linear arrangement that is characteristic of writing and that is not typical of decorative or symbolic art. Second, certain signs recur. Of the 28 distinct signs, several appear multiple times and a few appear 4 or 5 times, suggesting that they represent commonly used elements of a linguistic system rather than unique symbols with one-time significance. Third, certain signs appear to form pairs or groups that recur in the same sequence, a pattern consistent with words or phrases in a language. Fourth, the signs include both pictographic elements, recognizable images of insects, plants and other objects, and abstract geometric shapes, suggesting a mixed system that combines pictographic and non-pictographic signs. These observations are consistent with writing. They are also consistent with other forms of structured symbolic expression that do not encode language, mnemonic systems, tallying systems, or emblematic systems that convey meaning through convention, without recording the sounds or grammar of a spoken language. The distinction between writing and non-writing symbolic systems is, as discussed in previous episodes, one of the most difficult lines to draw in the study of early inscription, and the Cascajal Block falls squarely on the ambiguous side of that line. The epigrapher Stephen Houston, who co-authored the publication of the block, has been forthright about the limitations of the evidence. "We believe the Cascajal Block bears writing," Houston stated, "but we cannot prove it from a single text. Proof requires comparison. comparison with other texts in the same system, comparison with known writing systems, comparison with the language or languages that the system might record. We have none of these. We have a single stone, a handful of signs, and a conviction, based on the structural features of the text, that what we are looking at is language rendered visible, but conviction is not proof. Houston's candor highlights the fundamental problem. The Cascajal Block may be the earliest writing in the Americas. It may also be a sophisticated symbolic text that falls short of true writing. It may be an anomaly, a one-off experiment in symbolic notation that was not continued or developed. It may be a representative example of a widespread Olmec writing tradition that has otherwise been entirely lost. Each of these possibilities is consistent with the evidence. None can be confirmed. And the consequence is that the most important question in the history of Mesoamerican writing, did the Olmec invent writing, cannot be answered with confidence. But here is the problem. The Cascajal Block, whatever it is, did not emerge from a vacuum. The Olmec civilization that produced it was a culture of extraordinary symbolic sophistication, a culture that produced art, iconography, and symbolic systems of great complexity and consistency across a wide geographical area and over a period of more than a millennium. The colossal heads, the jade figurines, the carved altars and stelae, the elaborate ceramic vessels, all display a visual language of remarkable richness and internal coherence. The Olmec were not a preliterate culture fumbling towards symbolic expression. They were a culture that had mastered the art of visual communication, that could convey complex ideas about power, identity, cosmology, and social order through images and symbols of extraordinary sophistication. The question is not whether the Olmec had a symbolic system. They clearly did. The question is whether that symbolic system crossed the threshold from visual communication to linguistic encoding, whether it moved from conveying ideas through images to recording words through signs. The Cascajal Block suggests that it did. The rest of the evidence is ambiguous, and the ambiguity is compounded by the fact that the Olmec heartland, the hot, wet, biologically active lowlands of the Gulf Coast, is one of the worst environments in the world for the preservation of inscribed materials. The Olmec almost certainly wrote on perishable materials. This is not speculation. It is inference based on the practices of every other Mesoamerican civilization for which the evidence is more complete. The Maya wrote on bark paper, a material made from the inner bark of the wild fig tree, beaten into thin sheets and coated with lime plaster to create a smooth writing surface. The Aztec wrote on bark paper and on deerskin. The Mixtec produced elaborately painted codices on deerskin strips. These materials decompose rapidly in tropical environments. Of the thousands of Maya codices that are known to have existed at the time of the Spanish conquest, only 4 survive. The rest were destroyed by the combined forces of tropical decay, deliberate Spanish burning, and the passage of time. If the Olmec produced comparable documents, and their level of cultural sophistication makes it likely that they did, then those documents are gone, dissolved by the same tropical environment that sustained the civilization that produced them. The stone and ceramic objects that survive represent only the most durable fraction of the Olmec symbolic output. The bark paper, the painted textiles, the carved wood, the coloured earth, all the perishable media on which the Olmec may have written and painted, are gone. The Cascajal Block survived because it is stone. Everything that was written on less durable materials has been consumed by the jungle. The scale of what the jungle has consumed is difficult to estimate, but probably enormous. Consider the Maya analogy. At the time of the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, the Maya possessed thousands of bark paper codices, folded screen books, painted on both sides with glyphic texts and illustrations recording astronomical tables, ritual calendars, historical narratives, and tribute records. The Spanish bishop Diego de Landa, in an act of cultural vandalism that ranks among the worst in human history, ordered the systematic burning of Maya codices in 1562, destroying an estimated thousands of volumes. Even after Landa's bonfire, hundreds of codices remained in circulation, but the tropical climate, the political upheaval of the colonial period, and the continued destruction of indigenous cultural materials by Spanish authorities combined to consume nearly all of them. Today, 4 Maya codices survive, 4 out of a tradition that produced thousands. If the Olmec produced bark paper books at even a fraction of the rate the Maya did, and the Olmec's level of cultural sophistication makes this entirely plausible, then thousands of Olmec documents may have existed and been destroyed by the same tropical forces that consumed the Maya codices. But the Olmec had no Spanish bonfire to blame. Their documents were destroyed by the quieter and more implacable enemy of tropical humidity, fungal growth, and insect activity over 3,000 years of exposure. The Maya codices that survived did so because they were preserved in the relatively dry conditions of the Yucatan Peninsula. The Olmec heartland, in the lowland swamps of Veracruz and Tabasco, is far wetter, one of the wettest inhabited regions in the Americas. The preservation conditions are, for organic materials, catastrophic. A bark paper document left in the Olmec heartland would decompose within a few years. Over 3 millennia, the destruction would be total. The archaeologist Richard Deal, author of one of the standard reference works on the Olmec, has described the preservation problem with characteristic bluntness. We are studying a civilization that wrote on paper in a place where paper does not survive, Deal has observed. That is not a research challenge. That is a research tragedy. The evidence we need is gone. It has been gone for a very long time, and no amount of excavation can recover materials that have returned to the soil. Deal's observation carries a weight that extends beyond the specific case of the Olmec, the preservation bias of the archaeological record, the systematic overrepresentation of durable materials, and the systematic underrepresentation of perishable ones, distorts our understanding of every ancient civilization that operated in a tropical environment. We know more about the Mesopotamians than the Olmec, not because the Mesopotamians were more literate, but because they wrote on clay, which survives, while the Olmec probably wrote on bark paper, which does not. The difference in our knowledge reflects a difference in preservation conditions, not a difference in cultural achievement. The Olmec may have been as literate as the Sumerians. We will never know because the evidence has decomposed. This realization transforms the question of Olmec writing from a debate about a single artifact into a meditation on the nature of the evidence itself. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The fact that only one inscribed stone block has been found does not mean that only one was ever produced. It means that stone survives in the tropical lowlands and other materials do not. The Olmec writing tradition, if it existed, may have been vast, prolific, and sophisticated. We will never know because the materials on which it was practiced have returned to the earth from which they were made, and it gets worse. The Olmec civilization did not merely decline. It was, in some cases, deliberately destroyed. The archaeological record at San Lorenzo shows that sometime around 900 before the Common Era, roughly the same period to which the Cascajal Block is dated, the site underwent a catastrophic episode of monument destruction. The colossal heads were toppled, altars were defaced, sculptures were mutilated, buried, or dragged to the edges of the settlement. The destruction was systematic and thorough. It targeted specifically the most symbolically significant objects, the monuments that represented the power and authority of the ruling elite. Whether this destruction was the work of internal revolution, external invasion, or ritual termination, a deliberate closing ceremony in which the monuments were decommissioned as part of a cultural transition, is debated, but the result was the same. The symbolic landscape of San Lorenzo was deliberately obliterated, and whatever inscriptions may have existed on the destroyed monuments were obliterated with them. The destruction at San Lorenzo was not random, it was selective. The destroyers targeted specific categories of objects, the colossal heads, the throne-like altars, the carved stelae, while leaving other objects intact. This selectivity has been interpreted by the archaeologist Anne Cyphers, who has directed excavations at San Lorenzo for over 3 decades, as evidence of a ritual process rather than an act of conquest. In Cyphers' view, the monuments were not destroyed by enemies. They were decommissioned by the Olmec themselves, ceremonially killed, as it were, as part of a cultural transition in which one set of monuments and their associated symbols were replaced by another. The practice of ritually terminating monuments, deliberately breaking, burying, or defacing sacred objects at the end of their useful life is well attested in later Mesoamerican cultures and may have its origins in this Olmec practice. If Sisyphus is correct, then the destruction at San Lorenzo was not a catastrophe inflicted from outside, but a transformation initiated from within, a deliberate choice to end one symbolic era and begin another. This interpretation has profound implications for the question of Olmec writing. If the Olmec ritually terminated their monuments, and if those monuments bore inscriptions, then the termination was also a termination of texts. The texts were not lost to accident or neglect. They were deliberately ended, ceremonially destroyed as part of a cultural process that valued renewal over preservation. The Olmec may not have lost their writing. They may have chosen to let it go. The archaeological evidence at La Venta supports this interpretation. When La Venta was abandoned around 400 before the Common Era, its monuments were again carefully buried rather than randomly destroyed. The massive basalt columns that formed the ceremonial enclosures were toppled and covered with earth. The mosaic pavements, elaborate designs made of serpentine blocks, depicting what appear to be cosmological or mythological symbols, were dismantled and buried under layers of coloured clay in a specific sequence that appears to have been ritually prescribed. The burial was not haphazard. It was organised, systematic, and evidently meaningful to the people who carried it out. The buried mosaics are particularly suggestive. They depict composite designs, arrangements of geometric and figurative elements that some scholars have interpreted as cosmograms, symbolic maps of the universe. If these designs encode cosmological information, if they are, in some sense, texts that record ideas about the structure of the cosmos, then their deliberate burial represents the deliberate interment of cosmological knowledge. The Olmec were not merely burying stones, they were burying ideas, and the ideas, buried under meters of earth for over 2,000 years, are as inaccessible as the Cascajal Block's unreadable signs. The pattern of deliberate monument destruction repeated itself at La Venta, the successor site to San Lorenzo, which flourished from roughly 900 to 400 before the Common Era. When La Venta was abandoned, its monuments were again mutilated and buried. The basalt columns that had formed the ceremonial enclosures were toppled, the carved stelae were broken, the mosaic pavements, elaborate designs made of serpentine blocks, depicting what appear to be cosmological or mythological symbols, were dismantled and buried under layers of coloured clay. The destruction was not random. It was ritual, a careful, deliberate process of decommissioning, in which the sacred power of the monuments was neutralized before the site was abandoned. If the Olmec inscribed their monuments, and the evidence from other Mesoamerican civilizations suggests that monument inscription was a standard practice, then the deliberate destruction of those monuments was also a destruction of texts. Every defaced stela, every mutilated altar, every toppled head potentially bore inscriptions that were obliterated along with the images. The destroyer of the monument was, whether intentionally or not, the destroyer of the text. And the destroyer of the text was, whether knowingly or not, the destroyer of the only evidence that might have confirmed the existence and nature of Olmec writing. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The destruction was not carried out by foreign invaders. It was carried out by the Olmec themselves, or by their immediate successors, people who lived in the same region, spoke related languages, and inherited the cultural traditions of the Olmec heartland. The knowledge of Olmec writing, if it existed, was not stolen by an outside force. It was abandoned, transformed, or deliberately discarded by the people who held it. The loss was not imposed from outside. It came from within. This internal origin of the loss makes it different from the losses of Linear A or Rongo Rongo, which were driven by external forces, invasion, colonization, enslavement. The Olmec loss was a cultural decision, a choice made by a society in transition to leave behind one form of symbolic expression and adopt or develop another. The new forms, the Epi-Olmec script, the early Zapotec script, the Proto-Maya writing tradition, may have been direct descendants of the Olmec system, adapted and transformed beyond recognition. or they may have been independent innovations, inspired by the Olmec example but developed from scratch. Either way, the original was abandoned. The mother script was left behind by its own children. The linguistic dimension of this abandonment adds a final layer of complexity. The Olmec language, the language that the Cascajal Block and any other Olmec inscriptions would have recorded, is not directly attested. No Olmec text has been read. No Olmec word has been identified with certainty. The language is known only by inference, by the argument, first advanced by the linguists Lyle Campbell and Terence Kaufman, that the Olmec probably spoke a language of the Mixtecan family based on the distribution of Mixtecan loanwords in other Mesoamerican languages. The argument is widely accepted but not universal. Some scholars have proposed alternative identifications, that the Olmec spoke a Mayan language, or a Totonac language, or a language that has left no surviving descendants. The Mixtecan identification is significant because it implies a degree of linguistic continuity between the Olmec and later Gulf Coast populations. The modern Mixtecan languages are still spoken in the region by communities that live in and around the old Olmec heartland, that carry the cultural traditions of the Gulf Coast lowlands, and that may be the biological and cultural descendants of the Olmec themselves. If the Olmec spoke a Mixtecan language, and if the modern Mixtecan speakers are their descendants, then the linguistic chain that connects the Cascajal Block to the present day may not be entirely broken. The language changed, it evolved, it differentiated into multiple distinct languages, but the family persisted. The root survived, even if it transformed beyond recognition. This persistence has implications for the decipherment problem. If the Olmec language was Mixtecan, then the comparative data provided by modern Mixtecan languages, their vocabulary, their grammar, their phonological systems, could, in principle, guide the interpretation of Olmec inscriptions. Scholars could look for sign sequences on the Cascajal Block that correspond to reconstructed Proto-Mixtecan words. They could test whether the sign inventory is consistent with the phonological structure of a Mixtecan language. They could use the known features of Mixtecan grammar to predict the structure of Olmec sentences and compare those predictions with the sign patterns on the block. In practice, this approach has produced suggestive but inconclusive results. The Cascajal Block's 62 signs are simply too few to support the kind of detailed phonological and grammatical analysis that the approach requires. A few tentative correspondences have been proposed, sign sequences that might match Proto-Mixtecan words for specific concepts, but none has been confirmed, and the proposals remain in the realm of speculation rather than demonstration. The Mixtecan connection does, however, provide one concrete benefit. It constrains the range of possible languages that the Olmec script might record. If the Olmec language was Mixtecan, then proposals that the script records a Mayan, Totonac, or other non-Mixtecan language can be considered less likely. This is a modest constraint, but in a field where the evidence is so sparse that almost anything is possible, even a modest constraint is valuable. The silence that surrounds the Olmec script is not the silence of a civilization that was destroyed. It is the silence of a civilization that moved on, that outgrew its own beginnings, that transformed itself so thoroughly that the starting point was forgotten. The Olmec script is not a murdered language. It is an abandoned one, and the abandonment, quiet, internal, perhaps inevitable, is in its own way more unsettling than any act of external destruction, because it suggests that the loss of knowledge does not require a villain. It requires only change, and change over enough time erases everything. The Zapotec connection adds another dimension to this already complex picture. The Zapotec of the Valley of Oaxaca, in the highlands south of the Olmec heartland, developed what some scholars consider the earliest confirmed writing system in Mesoamerica, a script that appears on carved stone monuments at the Zapotec capital of Monte Alban, dating to roughly 500 before the Common Era. The Monte Alban inscriptions include what appear to be name glyphs, calendrical notations, and conquest records, a combination of content types that is consistent with a fully functional writing system used for political and administrative purposes. The relationship between the Zapotec script and the Olmec symbolic tradition is debated. Some scholars argue that the Zapotec developed their script independently, without influence from the Olmec. Others argue that the Zapotec script was inspired by Olmec precedents, that the Olmec example of using symbols to record names, dates, and political events served as a stimulus for the Zapotec development of their own script. The evidence is, once again, insufficient to settle the question. The Olmec and the Zapotec were in contact. Olmec-style artifacts have been found in Oaxaca, and Zapotec-style artifacts have been found in the Olmec heartland, but contact does not prove transmission, and the specific mechanism by which writing might have passed from one culture to the other has not been identified. The Maya script, the most fully developed and best documented writing system in pre-Columbian America, adds yet another layer. The Maya writing system, which was in use from roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era to the 16th century of the Common Era, was a fully logosyllabic system capable of recording any utterance in the Maya language with precision and nuance. It was used for historical narratives, astronomical calculations, ritual texts, diplomatic correspondence, and personal names. Its decipherment, which has progressed enormously since the 1960s, has revealed a literary and intellectual tradition of extraordinary richness. One of the great achievements of human civilization, the question of whether the Maya script descended from the Olmec script. Whether the Cascajal Block represents the grandparent of the Maya glyphs is one of the most tantalizing and most unanswerable questions in Mesoamerican studies. The Maya themselves left no account of the origin of their script. No Maya text describes the invention of writing or attributes it to any external source. The earliest Maya inscriptions appear fully developed. There is no visible period of experimental development, no gradual transition from simple to complex, no evidence of the trial and error process that would be expected if the Maya were inventing writing from scratch. This sudden appearance of a mature writing system has been cited by some scholars as evidence that the Maya adapted an existing system, possibly Olmec, rather than inventing one independently. But the argument is circumstantial, and the alternative explanation, that the developmental stages simply have not been found, either because they were recorded on perishable materials, or because the relevant sites have not been excavated, is equally plausible. The chain of descent that might connect the Cascajal Block to the Maya codices is, at present, entirely hypothetical. The Cascajal Block is dated to roughly 900 before the Common Era. The earliest confirmed Maya inscriptions date to roughly the 3rd century before the Common Era, a gap of roughly 600 years. During those 600 years, the Olmec civilization declined, the Epi-Olmec tradition emerged and disappeared, the Zapotec developed their own script, and the Maya began to develop theirs. The intermediate stages, the transitional scripts, the experimental forms, the hybrid systems that might have linked the Olmec beginning to the Maya flowering, are missing. They are missing because the evidence has not survived. And the evidence has not survived because the tropical environment of the Gulf Coast and the Yucatan lowlands has consumed every perishable medium on which those transitional forms might have been recorded. The gap between the Cascajal Block and the earliest Maya inscriptions is, in informational terms, a black hole. We know what existed at the beginning, the Olmec script, in whatever form it took. We know what existed at the end, the Maya script, in its full magnificent complexity. What happened in between, the developmental process that transformed one into the other, or that produced the other independently, is permanently invisible. The connecting thread, if it existed, was written on bark paper, or painted on cotton, or carved into wood, and the jungle has taken it all. This is the deepest dimension of the Olmec script's loss. It is not merely that we cannot read what the Olmec wrote. It is that we cannot trace the chain of descent that connects the earliest writing in the Americas to the later writing systems that we can read. The Maya script has been deciphered. The Zapotec script is partially understood. The Aztec script is well documented. But the origin of all of these, the moment when someone in Mesoamerica first had the idea of recording language in visible, permanent, transmissible form, is hidden behind the wall of the Olmec script's undecipherability. The origin story of writing in the Americas begins with a question mark. And the Cascajal Block, for all its importance, has not removed that question mark. It has only made it more visible. The study of the Olmec script is, necessarily, a study of fragments. Fragments of evidence, fragments of interpretation, fragments of a tradition that may have been vast, but that has left only the faintest trace in the archaeological record. Each investigation into the Olmec script is an exercise in inference, in building hypotheses from evidence so thin that the hypothesis is, inevitably, more substantial than the evidence that supports it. What follows are 5 investigations into the Olmec script and its legacy, each approaching the question from a different angle and each arriving, by a different route, at the same conclusion. The evidence is insufficient to resolve the fundamental questions, and the fundamental questions may never be resolved. The first investigation is the detailed analysis of the Cascajal Block itself, the attempt to extract the maximum possible information from the only confirmed Olmec inscription. The publishing team, Rodriguez Martinez, Houston, and their colleagues, conducted a comprehensive analysis of the block's physical and textual properties. They documented the dimensions, material, and surface condition of the block. They photographed and drew each sign individually. They created a complete catalogue of the 28 distinct sign types and mapped their distribution across the text. They analyzed the frequency of each sign type, the positional distribution of signs across the rows, and the patterns of sign combination. Their analysis revealed several noteworthy features. The most common sign, a stylized insect or arthropod, appears 7 times, accounting for roughly 11% of all sign tokens. The second most common sign, a form that has been tentatively identified as a maize kernel, appears 6 times. 5 signs appear only once. This frequency distribution, while based on an extremely small sample, is broadly consistent with the distributions observed in natural languages, in which a small number of common elements account for a disproportionate share of all occurrences. The team also identified what they called sequencing patterns, instances in which the same sign appears in the same position relative to other signs across different rows. These positional regularities are consistent with a system in which the position of a sign within a sequence carries structural meaning, as it would in a script that encodes the grammar of a language. But the sample is too small for the patterns to be statistically significant. They are suggestive, not definitive. The most controversial aspect of the team's analysis was their claim that the text contained no apparent pictorial narrative, that the signs did not form a pictographic story in the way that, for example, an Olmec altar carving tells a story through a sequence of images. This observation was cited as evidence that the signs functioned linguistically rather than pictorially, that they recorded words, not pictures. But critics pointed out that the distinction between linguistic and pictorial function is not always clear, and that a short text in an unknown script might look non-narrative simply because the viewer cannot identify the narrative. The Cascajal Block analysis, thorough as it was, reached its limits quickly. 62 signs are not enough to support the kind of detailed structural analysis that decipherment requires. The team's analysis described the text's properties. It could not decode them. The description remains the most detailed and the most rigorous analysis of the block that has been produced. It is also, by necessity, the most limited. The block has given up everything it has to give. What remains is silence. The second investigation concerns the broader Olmec symbolic system and its potential relationship to writing. The art historian and Mesoamerican specialist Carl Taub has conducted extensive studies of Olmec iconography, identifying a complex and internally consistent symbolic system that spans the full range of Olmec artistic production, from the colossal heads and carved altars to the smallest jade figurines and ceramic stamps. Taub's work, particularly his analysis of Olmec jade celts and their incised symbols, has been transformative for the field. He has identified recurring symbol combinations that appear on objects from widely separated sites, combinations that maintain their internal structure and their relative positioning across different media and different geographical contexts. This consistency is the hallmark of a conventionalized symbolic system, a system in which the relationship between symbols and their meanings is fixed by cultural convention rather than varying with the whim of individual artists. Toby has specifically identified what he calls the Olmec name-title complex, a set of symbols that appear adjacent to depicted figures on carved altars, jade objects, and stone monuments, and that seem to identify those figures by personal name, title, or lineage. The complex typically consists of 2 or 3 symbols arranged in a specific spatial relationship, one symbol above or before the other, in a configuration that is consistent across multiple objects. Taub argues that these name-title complexes represent a form of proto-writing, not a full script capable of recording continuous speech, but a specialized notation system that records specific categories of information, in this case, personal identity, using conventionalized symbols. The distinction between proto-writing and writing is crucial, and it illuminates a fundamental debate in the field. Proto-writing is a system of symbols that conveys specific standardized meanings, but that does not encode the sounds or grammar of a spoken language. Writing is a system that does encode sounds and grammar, that allows any utterance in a language to be recorded and reconstructed. The distinction is not binary, it is a continuum. At one end are purely iconic systems, pictures that represent what they depict. At the other end are fully phonetic scripts, alphabets that record every sound in a language. In between are mixed systems, proto-literate systems, mnemonic systems, and various hybrid forms that encode some features of language while leaving others unrecorded. The Olmec symbolic system, as documented by Taube, falls somewhere in the middle of this continuum. It is more than decoration. It conveys specific, standardized meanings that are consistent across sites and media. It is less than full writing. It does not, as far as can be determined from the surviving evidence, encode the sounds or grammar of the Olmec language. The Cascajal Block may represent a point further along the continuum, closer to full writing, but the question cannot be resolved from a single text. Taub has also identified what he believes are early forms of specific Mesoamerican symbols that would later become standard elements of the Maya and other writing systems. The cleft head motif, a head with a vertical cleft or division in the forehead, appears in Olmec art and reappears as a Maya day sign. The crossed bands motif, an X-shaped symbol, appears in Olmec iconography and reappears as a Maya glyph element. The maize cob sign, a stylized representation of an ear of corn, appears on the Cascajal Block and on later Mesoamerican inscriptions. These shared motifs do not prove a direct scribal descent from Olmec to Maya. They may reflect shared cultural themes rather than shared script elements, but they suggest a deep continuity of symbolic tradition across the Mesoamerican world, with the Olmec at its earliest documented stage. Taub has argued that the Olmec were, in effect, the inventors of Mesoamerican visual culture, that the symbolic vocabulary they developed, including the conventions for depicting rulers, deities, cosmological concepts, and calendrical information, was adopted by subsequent cultures and gradually elaborated into the full writing systems that emerged in the centuries after the Olmec decline. In this view, the Olmec script, if it existed, was not a separate invention that was later replaced. It was the seed of a tradition that grew over centuries into the writing systems of the Maya, the Zapotec, and the other literate cultures of Mesoamerica. The seed is no longer visible, consumed by the soil that sustained it, but the plant that grew from it is the entire tradition of Mesoamerican literacy. This is an elegant and influential interpretation. It is also, as Taub himself acknowledges, based on inference rather than direct evidence. The seed cannot be examined, only the plant can be studied. And the plant, while it is consistent with having grown from an Olmec seed, is also consistent with having grown from multiple independent seeds in different parts of Mesoamerica. The debate continues. The third investigation is the attempt to connect the Olmec script to later Mesoamerican writing systems through the analysis of shared sign forms and structural principles. The epigrapher Javier Urcid, who has spent decades studying the early writing systems of Mesoamerica, has argued that the Zapotec script of Monte Alban and the Isthmian or Epi-Olmec script of the Gulf Coast share structural features that suggest a common ancestry, an ancestor that may be the Olmec script or something closely related to it. Ursid has identified what he considers to be shared sign types, signs that appear in both the Zapotec and the Isthmian corpora, and that bear formal resemblances to each other and, in some cases, to signs on the Cascajal Block. These shared signs include what appear to be calendrical elements, day signs and month signs, that are organized according to principles consistent with the Mesoamerican calendar system. Ursid's proposed connections are detailed and scholarly. They are also highly speculative because the sign forms in question are separated by centuries and by hundreds of kilometers. The resemblances may reflect genuine historical relationships, descent from a common ancestor, or they may reflect independent development of similar solutions to similar problems. A day sign that looks like a jaguar face in the Zapotec script and a day sign that looks like a jaguar face in the Isthmian script may both derive from an Olmec original, or they may both derive independently from the Pan-Mesoamerican association between jaguars and specific calendrical periods. The resemblance, without a documented chain of transmission, is ambiguous. The fourth investigation concerns the Epi-Olmec script and the question of whether it represents a continuation of the Olmec writing tradition. The Epi-Olmec script, as discussed earlier, is represented primarily by the Lamahara stela and the Tuxtla statuette. The Justerson Kaufmann decipherment, published in 1993, proposed that the script recorded a Mixtecan language, a language related to the languages that were probably spoken by the Olmec. If the decipherment is correct, then the Epi-Olmec script is, linguistically at least, a descendant of the Olmec tradition, a writing system that records a language of the same family as the Olmec language in a region that was the Olmec heartland. But the connection between the Epi-Olmec script and the Cascajal Block script is far from clear. The two scripts are separated by roughly 700 years. Their sign inventories do not overlap in any obvious way. The Cascajal Block has 28 distinct signs. The Epi-Olmec script has over 150. The formats are different, the sign forms are different, and the overall visual character of the two scripts is different. If the Epi-Olmec script is a descendant of the Cascajal Block script, the descendant has changed so dramatically that the family resemblance is invisible. This is not, in itself, implausible. Writing systems can change enormously over centuries. The modern Arabic script bears little visual resemblance to the Phoenician alphabet from which it ultimately descends, despite a documented chain of transmission spanning over 2,000 years. The Chinese script of today looks nothing like the oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty, despite an unbroken tradition of literacy spanning over 3 millennia. Visual change is the norm in the history of writing. Visual continuity is the exception. The absence of visual similarity between the Cascajal Block and the Epi-Olmec script does not prove that they are unrelated, but it does mean that the relationship, if it exists, cannot be demonstrated from the visual evidence alone. The fifth investigation is the most recent and the most technologically innovative. The use of portable X-ray fluorescence and three-dimensional scanning to analyze the physical properties of the Cascajal Block and other Olmec inscribed objects in unprecedented detail. These non-destructive analytical techniques allow researchers to examine the chemical composition of the stone, the depth and profile of the incised signs, and the microscopic tool marks left by the carving process, all without removing the object from its museum case or damaging its surface. The results, published in a series of studies over the past decade, have confirmed that the Cascajal Block is made of a type of serpentine that is consistent with geological sources in the Olmec heartland. The tool marks are consistent with carving by a hard, sharp instrument, likely obsidian, applied with consistent pressure and direction. The signs were carved by a skilled practitioner using a standardized technique. None of these findings resolve the question of whether the signs constitute writing, but they confirm that the block is a genuine Olmec artifact, produced by a skilled craftsman, using techniques consistent with the known Olmec artistic tradition. The three-dimensional scanning has also revealed subtle details of the signs that are not visible in two-dimensional photographs. Variations in depth, slight asymmetries in the carving, and traces of wear that suggest the block was handled over an extended period. These details do not change the fundamental picture. The block remains a short, isolated, undecipherable text, but they add to the accumulating body of physical data that may, someday, prove useful if additional inscriptions are found and if comparative analysis becomes possible. These 5 investigations, the detailed analysis of the Cascajal Block, the study of Olmec iconographic proto-writing, the search for connections to later Mesoamerican scripts, the analysis of the Epi-Olmec connection, and the application of advanced physical analysis techniques, represent the current state of Olmec script research. The state is, to be frank, one of informed uncertainty. Scholars know more about the Cascajal Block, about Olmec symbolism, and about the relationships between early Mesoamerican writing systems than they did 2 decades ago. But the central questions, was there an Olmec script? What was it like? And how was it related to later Mesoamerican writing? Remain open. The evidence has grown. The answers have not. The scholarly community's frustration is captured in a remark by the Mayanist Simon Martin, who has written about the problem of early Mesoamerican writing with characteristic precision. We are in the peculiar position, Martin has observed, of knowing more about the descendants than the ancestor. We can read Maya glyphs with confidence. We can partially read Zapotec inscriptions. We have a disputed but detailed proposed reading of the Epi-Olmec script. But the origin, the Olmec script itself, if it existed, is a blank. We can trace the branches of the Mesoamerican writing tree in some detail. The root is invisible. Martin's metaphor of the invisible root captures the core frustration of Olmec script studies. The later Mesoamerican scripts, Maya, Zapotec, Isthmian, are not themselves fully understood, but they are documented by corpora large enough to support analysis. The Olmec script has no such corpus. It is the root of a tree that can be studied from the branches downward, but that disappears below the surface into undocumented darkness. The root may be there. It may nourish the tree, but it cannot be examined because the soil, the tropical soil of the Gulf Coast, has consumed it. The 5 investigations examined here have collectively produced a body of knowledge about the Olmec symbolic tradition that is far richer and more nuanced than what was available even 2 decades ago. The Cascajal Block has been analysed in extraordinary detail. The broader Olmec iconographic system has been mapped and classified. The connections to later Mesoamerican scripts have been explored, debated, and partially documented. The Epi-Olmec script has been subjected to a detailed, if contested, decipherment, and advanced physical analysis techniques have confirmed the authenticity and the material provenance of the key artifacts. But the central question, was there an Olmec script, remains, in the strictest scholarly sense, unconfirmed. The Cascajal Block says, probably yes. The broader iconographic evidence says, possibly. The Epi-Olmec connection says, there was a later script in the same region that may be descended from an Olmec original. The physical analysis says, the artifacts are genuine. None of these answers, individually or collectively, constitutes proof. Proof requires more evidence, more inscriptions, more contexts, more data points against which to test the hypotheses. And the evidence, consumed by 3,000 years of tropical exposure, may never be found. The Justerson-Kaufmann decipherment of the Epi-Olmec script deserves more detailed examination because it represents the closest approach to a reading of any Olmec-related text. The decipherment was based on 2 principal texts, the La Mogara Stela and the Tuxtla Statuette. The La Mogara Stela, with its approximately 535 glyphs, is by far the longer and more important of the 2. It bears 2 long count dates that correspond to approximately 143 and 156 of the Common Era, placing it firmly in the Epi-Olmec period. Several centuries after the decline of the major Olmec centers, but within the geographical heartland of the Olmec civilization. Justerson and Kaufmann began their decipherment by identifying the calendrical components of the text, the day names, month names, and long count elements that could be matched to the known Mesoamerican calendar system. From these calendrical anchors, they worked outward, identifying what they believed to be verb phrases, noun phrases, and narrative sequences describing political events. Their proposed readings described a narrative in which a ruler performed a series of ritual and political actions, bloodletting ceremonies, military conquests, and astronomical observations over a period of roughly 13 years. The language they identified was Pre-Protozoican, an early member of the Mixtecs family, which includes languages still spoken in the region today. The decipherment was published to great fanfare and immediately attracted both support and criticism. The supporters, including several prominent Mesoamericanist linguists, praised the method as rigorous and the results as internally consistent. The critics, including the epigrapher Stephen Houston, who had co-authored the Cascajal Block publication, argued that the method was too flexible, that the sign values were underdetermined, and that the proposed readings could not be independently verified because the corpus was too small. The debate has continued for 3 decades without resolution. The most damaging criticism came from the linguist Terence Kaufman's own subsequent reassessment of the decipherment. In papers published in the 2000s, Kaufman revised several of his earlier readings, acknowledging errors and proposing alternative values for some signs. These revisions were presented as refinements, normal adjustments in an ongoing research program, but critics argued that the need for revision demonstrated the fundamental instability of the proposed readings. If the sign values were correct, they should not need to be revised. The fact that they were revised suggested that the original values were not securely established, that they were educated guesses rather than confirmed readings. The current status of the Justason-Kaufmann decipherment is charitably uncertain. A minority of scholars accept it as substantially correct. A majority regard it as partially correct at best and substantially speculative at worst. The decipherment has not been independently replicated. No other scholar has produced a reading of the La Mohara text that agrees with the Justason-Kaufmann reading in all or even most of its details. The text remains, for practical purposes, unread, or at least unagreed upon, which amounts to the same thing. The significance of the Justason-Kaufmann episode for the broader question of the Olmec script is twofold. First, it demonstrates that even a relatively large Epi-Olmec corpus, 535 glyphs on a single monument, is not large enough to support a definitive decipherment in the absence of bilingual evidence or independent confirmation. If 535 glyphs are not enough, then 62 glyphs, the Cascajal Block's total, are not merely insufficient, they are trivially insufficient. The Cascajal Block cannot be deciphered by any method that has failed even with a corpus nearly 10 times larger. Second, the Justason-Kaufmann episode illustrates the difficulty of working in a field where the evidence is sparse and the stakes are high. The decipherment of a Mesoamerican script, any Mesoamerican script, is a major scholarly achievement that attracts media attention, institutional recognition, and professional prestige. The temptation to announce a decipherment before the evidence is sufficient to support one is real and persistent. The history of Olmec and Epi-Olmec studies is littered with premature claims. Claims that generated excitement, attracted attention, and subsequently failed to withstand scrutiny. The Justason-Kaufmann decipherment may prove to be the exception, the premature claim that eventually turns out to be correct, or it may prove to be another entry in the long catalogue of false starts. Only additional evidence can decide. There is a moment, standing in the hot, humid lowlands of Veracruz, surrounded by the lush vegetation that has reclaimed the ruins of San Lorenzo and La Venta, when the scale of the loss becomes palpable. The jungle is dense, the air is thick, the earth underfoot is the same alluvial soil that the Olmec farmed, the same clay from which they made their pottery, the same ground into which they buried their mosaic pavements and their mutilated monuments. The civilization that flourished here, that carved colossal heads from basalt, that built vast earthen platforms, that traded jade and obsidian across thousands of kilometers, and that may have invented writing in the Western Hemisphere, has been swallowed by the landscape that sustained it. The jungle has taken it all. The experience of visiting the Olmec heartland is fundamentally different from visiting the ruins of other ancient civilizations. In Egypt, the monuments protrude from the desert, visible, imposing, impossible to ignore. In Greece, the temples stand on hilltops, their columns catching the light. In Mesoamerica itself, the Maya pyramids of Tikal and Palenque rise above the tree canopy, their limestone surfaces gleaming in the tropical sun. But the Olmec sites are different. They are low, they are subtle, they blend into the landscape, their earthen platforms merging with the natural contours of the terrain, their monuments buried or scattered, their outlines softened by centuries of erosion and vegetation. You can stand on the summit of the great platform at San Lorenzo and see nothing but fields and forest in every direction. The city that once covered 700 hectares is invisible. The landscape has reclaimed it. This invisibility is not merely an aesthetic observation. It is a material fact with direct implications for the survival of inscribed objects. In Egypt, inscribed surfaces are exposed. They stand in the open air, visible to anyone who passes. In the Olmec heartland, inscribed surfaces are buried, sunk beneath meters of alluvial sediment, covered by vegetation, hidden from view. An inscribed stone monument at an Egyptian site can be read by a passing traveller. An inscribed stone monument at an Olmec site must first be found, dug from the earth, cleaned of centuries of accumulated soil and roots, and examined by a specialist who knows what to look for. The discovery of Olmec inscriptions depends not on casual observation but on systematic excavation, and systematic excavation of the Olmec heartland has been limited, intermittent, and hampered by the practical difficulties of working in a tropical lowland environment. The total area of the Olmec heartland, the region in which the three major Olmec centers and their associated settlements were located, covers roughly 18,000 square kilometers. Of this area, less than 1% has been subjected to systematic archaeological excavation. The vast majority of the Olmec landscape remains unexplored, not because archaeologists lack interest, but because the resources required for systematic survey and excavation in a tropical environment are enormous. Each hectare of tropical forest that is cleared and excavated requires a massive investment of labor, equipment, and time, and produces in most cases a modest yield of artifacts, many of which are damaged by the environmental conditions. The 1% of the Olmec heartland that has been excavated has produced the Cascajal Block, the colossal heads, the jade celts, the buried mosaics, and all the other artifacts on which our understanding of the Olmec is based. The remaining 99% is a reservoir of undiscovered material, a vast unexplored archive that may contain additional inscriptions, additional evidence of writing, and additional data that could transform our understanding of the Olmec symbolic tradition. The probability that additional Olmec inscriptions exist, buried in the 99% of the heartland that has not been excavated, is, by any reasonable assessment, high. The probability that those inscriptions will be found, given the practical and financial constraints on tropical archaeology, is, by any realistic assessment, low. Let that sink in. The Olmec script, if it existed in the full sense of a writing system, is not merely undeciphered, it is unrecovered. Unlike Linear A, which has a corpus of 1,500 inscriptions, or the Indus Valley script, which has 4,000 inscribed objects, or Rongorongo, which has 26 surviving tablets, the Olmec script has a corpus of one stone block, 62 signs, and a scattering of disputed, fragmentary, ambiguous evidence on a handful of other objects. The comparison with other lost scripts reveals the unique character of the Olmec loss. In every other case, Linear A, the Indus script, Rongorongo, the Phaistos disc, the problem is one of decipherment. The evidence exists in sufficient quantity to be analysed, even if the analysis does not produce a reading. The Olmec script does not even present a decipherment problem. It presents a recovery problem. The evidence for the script's existence is so thin that the first task is not to decipher it, but to find it, to locate additional inscriptions that would confirm the existence of a writing tradition and provide the corpus that decipherment requires. This distinction between a decipherment problem and a recovery problem has profound implications for how we think about the Olmec contribution to the history of writing. For Linear A, we can say with certainty that a writing system existed, even though we cannot read it. For the Olmec script, we cannot even say that with certainty. We can say that the Cascajal Block exists. We can say that it bears signs arranged in a textual format. We can say that the signs exhibit features consistent with writing. But we cannot say with the confidence that the word certainty implies that the Olmec had a writing system. The evidence supports the hypothesis, it does not confirm it. The deeper truth of the Olmec script's loss is not about the script itself, it is about the nature of evidence and the limits of inference. We are accustomed to thinking of the past as something that is gradually revealed through excavation and analysis, something that becomes clearer as we dig deeper and study harder. The Olmec script challenges this assumption. 3,000 years of tropical exposure have not merely obscured the evidence, they have destroyed it. The bark paper has decomposed, the wooden tablets have rotted, the painted textiles have dissolved. The only medium that survived, stone, is the one the Olmec used least. The past has not been buried, it has been consumed, and what consumption leaves behind is not a fainter version of the original. It is nothing, an absence where presence once was, a void where knowledge once lived. The Olmec case is unique among the world's lost scripts because it combines two distinct forms of loss. The first is the loss of the script itself, the disappearance of the writing system, along with the language it recorded and the cultural context in which it was used. This is the familiar form of loss that we have encountered with Linear A, the Indus script, Rongorongo, and the Phaistos disc. The second form is less familiar and more insidious, the loss of the evidence that the script ever existed. For other undeciphered scripts, the existence of the script is established beyond doubt. The inscriptions are there, in quantity, waiting to be read. For the Olmec script, even the existence of the script is a hypothesis rather than a fact. The evidence that would confirm the hypothesis, additional inscriptions, a substantial corpus, a bilingual text, has been destroyed by the same tropical forces that sustained the civilization that produced it. This double loss of the script and loss of the evidence for the script, creates a uniquely frustrating situation for scholars. They cannot study what they cannot find. They cannot decipher what they cannot confirm. They cannot draw conclusions from evidence that may not exist. The scholarly enterprise is, at its core, an enterprise of evidence. Without evidence, there is nothing to study. And without anything to study, there is nothing to conclude. The Olmec script reduces the scholarly enterprise to its most basic and most helpless form, the search for something that may or may not be there in a place where the conditions for finding it are as unfavorable as anywhere on Earth. The frustration is compounded by the tantalizing nature of the Cascajal Block. The block exists. It is real. It bears signs that look like writing. Everything about it, the linear arrangement, the recurring sign groups, the mixture of pictographic and abstract elements, is consistent with a genuine writing system. If the block is what it appears to be, it is one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. But it is one block, and one block, however significant, cannot support the weight of the conclusions that scholars want to draw from it. The parallel with other fields of science is instructive. In particle physics, a single observation of a new particle is not considered a discovery. It is considered an anomaly, a potentially significant but unconfirmed data point that must be replicated before it is accepted. In medicine, a single case report is not considered evidence. It is considered an anecdote, a suggestive but unreliable data point that must be supported by controlled studies before it is acted upon. In both fields, the standard of evidence requires replication. The Cascajal Block has not been replicated. Until a second Olmec inscription is found, confirming that the Cascajal Block is not an anomaly but a representative example of a broader tradition. The block remains, in the strictest scientific sense, an unconfirmed observation. The search for that confirmation continues. Archaeologists working in the Olmec heartland are aware that additional inscriptions may exist, buried in unexcavated deposits, hidden in museum storerooms, or lying in plain sight on objects that have been misidentified. The discovery of the Cascajal Block has sharpened the scholarly focus on Olmec symbolic expression, and researchers are now examining Olmec artifacts with a heightened awareness of the possibility that some of the symbols they contain may be writing rather than decoration. This heightened awareness has already produced several candidates, objects bearing signs that might be Olmec script, but none has been confirmed with the level of certainty that the field requires. the search is hampered by the same environmental factors that destroyed the original evidence. The Olmec heartland is, today, an active agricultural and industrial zone. The ancient sites are surrounded by cattle ranches, sugarcane fields, and oil refineries. The archaeological landscape is being continuously disturbed by modern activity. New finds are made constantly. Artifacts are turned up by ploughing, by construction, and by the natural erosion of riverbanks. But they are almost always out of context, removed from their original settings by the same forces that displaced the Cascajal Block. The prospect of finding an Olmec inscription in a secure archaeological context, in its original position, surrounded by datable materials, with clear evidence of its age and function, is, given the conditions of the region, remote. The specific character of the Olmec loss becomes clearer when compared with the losses of other scripts. Linear A was lost because the Minoan language died. The script is physically present, in abundance, but the key to reading it vanished with the last Minoan speaker. The Indus Valley script was lost because the inscriptions are too short and the language is unknown. The evidence exists, but in insufficient quantity and without a linguistic key. Rongorongo was lost because the people who could read it were killed. The key was human, and the humans were destroyed. The Phaistos disc was lost because the artifact is unique. The evidence exists, but in a quantity so small that analysis is impossible. The Olmec script was lost because the evidence was consumed by the environment. The key may or may not have been human. The Olmec language may or may not have survived in the Mixtecan languages that are still spoken in the region. The inscriptions may or may not have been numerous. The Olmec may have produced thousands of written documents, all on perishable materials. The script may or may not have been the ancestor of all Mesoamerican writing. We cannot answer any of these questions because the physical evidence that would answer them has been destroyed by 3,000 years of tropical exposure. This environmental destruction is the most impersonal and the most implacable form of knowledge loss. It does not require a villain. It does not require a catastrophe. It does not even require human negligence. It requires only time and moisture, two forces that are, in the Olmec heartland, inexhaustible. The jungle is patient. It does not hurry. It takes what it takes at its own pace, a centimetre of decomposition per year, a millimetre of soil accumulation per century, a metre of sediment per millennium. Over 3,000 years, the pace is irrelevant. The result is total. The bark is gone. The cotton is gone. The wood is gone. The painted surfaces, the carved surfaces, the inscribed surfaces. Everything that was not stone or fired clay is gone. The jungle has been extraordinarily thorough. The thoroughness of the destruction raises a question that is rarely asked in discussions of the Olmec script, but that deserves explicit attention. Is it possible that the Olmec script was far more developed than the Cascajal Block suggests? Is it possible that the Olmec possessed a fully developed writing system, a system comparable in complexity and capability to layer writing, and that the Cascajal Block is not a representative example of this system, but an atypical one? The block, after all, is small, relatively simple, and possibly early in date. It might represent the beginning of a tradition that, over the following centuries, developed into something far more complex and far more capable. The fully developed Olmec script, if it existed, might have been as complex as Maya writing, as nuanced, as expressive, as capable of recording any utterance in the Olmec language. But the fully developed version was written on bark paper, and the bark paper is gone. This possibility, that the Cascajal Block represents the tip of an iceberg whose submerged mass we can never see, is, in a sense, the most haunting aspect of the Olmec script's loss. We may be judging the Olmec's literate capabilities by their least impressive surviving artifact. The Cascajal Block may be to Olmec writing what a child typewriter is to English literature. A simple introductory text that gives no indication of the language's full expressive range. The great works of Olmec literature, the epics, the cosmologies, the historical narratives, the political records, may have been incomparably more complex and more informative, and they may all be gone. This is not science fiction. This is the actual condition of the Olmec evidence, the most important early civilization in the Americas, the civilization that may have invented writing, that certainly invented the calendrical system, that produced the first monumental art that established the iconographic and symbolic traditions that would persist for 2 millennia, is known primarily through its most durable products: stone sculptures, jade objects, and ceramic vessels. Everything else, the bark paper documents, the painted textiles, the carved wooden objects, the organic materials on which the richest and most detailed expressions of Olmec culture were almost certainly recorded, is gone. The archaeologist Michael Coe, whose landmark book on the Olmec did more than any other single publication to establish the civilization's importance in the public imagination, described the situation in terms that capture both the magnitude of the loss and the frustration of the scholar. The Olmec were the mother civilization of Mesoamerica, Coe wrote. They were the people who started it all: the art, the religion, the calendar, and, in all probability, the writing. And we know less about them than about almost any other major civilization in the ancient world. Not because they were unimportant, because they lived in a place where the evidence does not survive. Coe's observation goes to the heart of the matter. The Olmec are not obscure because they were marginal. They are obscure because they were tropical. The environment that sustained them destroyed the evidence of their achievements. The accident of geography, the fact that the Olmec heartland is one of the wettest, hottest, and most biologically active regions in the Americas, has conspired with the passage of time to erase the very evidence that would establish the Olmec's contribution to the history of human civilization. The implications extend far beyond Olmec studies. How many other civilizations, in tropical Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Amazon basin, in the Pacific Islands, have been similarly erased by the environments in which they developed? How many writing systems, how many literatures, how many intellectual traditions have been consumed by jungle, monsoon, and tropical decay? The Olmec case is not an anomaly. It is a representative example of a universal problem: the systematic destruction of the evidence of tropical civilizations by the very environments that sustained them. The archaeological record is not a random sample of human history. It is a biased sample, biased in favor of dry environments, stone construction, and durable media, and biased against wet environments, organic construction, and perishable media. The civilizations we know best are the civilizations that left the most durable remains. The civilizations we know least, or not at all, are the ones that built with wood and wrote on bark. The magnitude of this bias can be estimated through a simple thought experiment. Imagine 2 civilizations of equal size, equal sophistication, and equal productivity. One develops in a desert, the other develops in a tropical rainforest. Both produce the same quantity of inscribed objects, the same number of documents, the same number of records, the same number of literary works. After 3,000 years, the desert civilization's record is substantially intact. Clay tablets, stone stelae, and dried papyrus scrolls survive in the arid conditions. The tropical civilization's record is almost entirely destroyed. Bark paper, wooden tablets, and cotton textiles have decomposed in the warm, humid environment. The desert civilization is well known, extensively studied, and richly documented. The tropical civilization is obscure, poorly understood, and documented only by its most durable artifacts, its stone sculptures and its ceramic vessels. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is the actual relationship between Mesopotamia and the Olmec. Both were early civilizations. Both developed writing. Both produced extensive bodies of inscribed material. But Mesopotamia developed in a desert, and the Olmec developed in a tropical lowland. Mesopotamia's clay tablets survived. The Olmec's bark paper documents did not. Mesopotamia is one of the best documented civilizations in the ancient world. The Olmec are one of the least. The difference is not one of achievement. It is one of preservation. The preservation bias has distorted not just our understanding of the Olmec, but our understanding of the entire history of writing. The standard accounts of the invention of writing, the accounts found in textbooks, encyclopedias, and popular histories, emphasize Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica as the primary or sole centers of independent writing invention. These are the places where the evidence has survived. But the evidence has survived because the environments were favorable, because the media were durable, or the climate was dry, or the ground was stable. The standard accounts may be missing entire traditions of writing that developed in less favorable environments. Tropical forests, monsoon zones, riverine floodplains, and that left no trace in the archaeological record because the evidence decomposed. The Olmec script may be a case in point. It may have been a fully developed writing system, as sophisticated as Sumerian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs, that left no readable trace because it was practiced on perishable media in a hostile preservation environment. If so, our ignorance of the Olmec script is not a reflection of the Olmec's limitations. It is a reflection of our own, a limitation imposed not by the absence of ancient achievement, but by the absence of surviving evidence of that achievement. This is the deepest and most uncomfortable implication of the Olmec script's loss. It suggests that the history of writing, as we currently understand it, may be significantly incomplete. Not because we have failed to discover the evidence, but because the evidence has been destroyed by environmental processes over which neither the original writers nor the modern investigators had any control. The history we know is the history of durable media. The history we do not know, the history of bark and cotton and wood, may be equally rich, equally important, and permanently inaccessible. And the most unsettling part, we may be doing the same thing right now. Our own civilization's most important records are stored on digital media that are even less durable than bark paper. A flash drive in the Gulf Coast lowlands would not survive a decade. A clay tablet, under the same conditions, can survive 3 millennia. The Cascajal Block, carved in stone, has outlasted everything the Olmec produced on perishable materials. The hierarchy of durability is clear. Stone endures, clay endures, bark does not, silicon does not. The Olmec chose bark, we chose silicon. Neither choice was made with permanence in mind, and the consequences for both civilizations are the same. The medium fails before the message is delivered. What does the loss of the Olmec script mean for how we understand the history of civilization? It means that the origin of writing in the Americas, one of the most important intellectual events in the history of the Western Hemisphere, is shrouded in an obscurity that may be permanent. The first chapter of the story of Mesoamerican literacy is missing. The Maya script, the Zapotec script, the Mixtec script, the Aztec script, all the great writing traditions of pre-Columbian America emerged from a background that we cannot see. Whether that background included a fully developed Olmec writing system, a proto-literate symbolic tradition, or something else entirely, we do not know. The journey of this story has taken us from a road construction site in Veracruz to the deepest questions in the archaeology of writing. The path has led through colossal stone heads and buried mosaic pavements, through jade celts and ceramic vessels, through the La Mohara stela and the Tuxtla statuette, through the dense tropical forests that consumed the perishable evidence of 3 millennia of cultural production. The conclusion is sober and specific. The Olmec script, as represented by the Cascajal Block, is probably genuine. It probably represents the earliest writing in the Americas. But the evidence is insufficient to confirm this with certainty, and the prospects for finding additional evidence are, given the preservation conditions of the Gulf Coast lowlands, limited. This uncertainty has consequences that extend beyond the academic study of Mesoamerican epigraphy. The origin of writing is one of the most fundamental questions in the study of human civilization. Writing transformed every society that adopted it, enabling bureaucratic administration, historical record-keeping, literary expression, and the accumulation of knowledge across generations. Understanding how writing originated, where, when, why, and under what conditions is essential for understanding the broader process by which human societies develop complexity. If the Olmec invented writing in the Americas, the implications for our understanding of that process are significant. It would demonstrate that writing can emerge in a tropical lowland environment in a relatively small society, without the stimulus of contact with an existing literate civilization. This would challenge the prevailing models of writing origin, which tend to emphasize urban concentration, bureaucratic necessity, and cross-cultural contact as preconditions for the development of writing. But if the Olmec did not invent writing, if the Cascajal Block represents a proto-literate symbolic system rather than a true writing system, then the first true writing in the Americas emerged, Later, in the Zapotec highlands or the Maya lowlands, under different conditions and for different reasons. The two scenarios have different implications for our understanding of how civilizations develop the capacity for literacy, and the choice between them depends on evidence that may never be found. The philosopher of history R.G. Collingwood argued that the past can only be known through its evidence, that historical knowledge is, fundamentally, knowledge of evidence. Where the evidence is absent, historical knowledge is impossible. The Olmec script is a case study in Collingwood's principle. The past event, the invention of writing in the Americas, occurred. It left evidence. The evidence was destroyed by environmental processes, and the historical knowledge that the evidence would have provided is, as a consequence, permanently beyond reach. The connection between the opening of this story and this moment is the connection between discovery and uncertainty. We began with a stone block pulled from rubble by road workers. We end with the recognition that the block may be the only surviving trace of a writing tradition that was once, if it existed, broad, productive, and culturally central. The block is a fragment of a conversation that lasted centuries and that has been reduced by the destructive forces of time and environment to a single, isolated utterance. We can see the utterance. We cannot hear the conversation. Are we making the same mistakes? The question has a specific resonance in the context of the Olmec loss, because the Olmec loss was driven not by human violence, as was the case with Rongorongo, or by linguistic extinction, as was the case with Linear A, but by environmental destruction of perishable records. This is a mode of loss that applies directly to the modern world. Our most important records are stored on media that are, by historical standards, extraordinarily fragile. Digital storage degrades within years. Paper, under tropical conditions, degrades within decades. Only stone and fired clay endure for millennia, and we write on neither. The Olmec wrote on stone when they wanted permanence. The Cascajal Block survived because it was stone. Everything else, everything that was written on bark, on cotton, on wood, is gone. The lesson is direct and uncomfortable. If you want your message to survive, carve it in stone. If you write it on anything else, the jungle, or its modern equivalents, bit rot, format obsolescence, institutional failure, will eventually consume it. The gap between what the Olmec achieved and what we know about their achievements is a measure of everything that tropical environments have taken from the human record. It is a measure of the bias in our knowledge, the systematic overrepresentation of dry climate civilizations, and the systematic underrepresentation of wet climate civilizations in our understanding of human history. The Olmec built one of the foundational civilizations of the Americas. We cannot read their writing. The disparity between achievement and knowledge is the disparity between the durability of culture and the fragility of evidence. The modern parallel is direct and uncomfortable. We store our knowledge on silicon, a medium that is, in terms of durability, roughly comparable to bark paper. A hard drive lasts 3 to 5 years. A solid-state drive lasts somewhat longer. Optical media, CDs, DVDs, Blu-ray discs, degrade within decades. Magnetic tape, the medium used for most institutional archival storage, degrades within 15 to 30 years. None of these media will survive for a century, let alone a millennium. The Cascajal Block, carved in serpentine, has survived for 3,000 years. Our digital records will not survive for 30 without active maintenance, without the continuous operation of the institutional, economic, and technological systems that keep servers running, formats readable, and data accessible. The Olmec did not choose bark paper because it was durable. They chose it because it was available, flexible, and well-suited to the production of the documents their civilization required. We did not choose silicon because it is durable. We chose it because it is fast, efficient, and well-suited to the computational demands of our civilization. In both cases, the choice of medium was driven by functional considerations, not by considerations of permanence. And in both cases, the consequence of the choice is the same. The records are fragile, the evidence is perishable, and the long-term survival of the civilization's written heritage depends on conditions that cannot be guaranteed. The Olmec could not have known that their bark paper documents would decompose. They could not have anticipated the 3,000 years of tropical exposure that would consume their records. We, however, can anticipate. We know that digital media degrade. We know that file formats become obsolete. We know that institutions fail. We know that the systems on which our digital archives depend are vulnerable to disruption. We have, in the Olmec example, a clear and specific warning about the consequences of relying on fragile media for the preservation of essential knowledge. The question is whether we will heed the warning, or whether, 3,000 years from now, some future civilization will excavate our ruins, find a corroded server in a collapsed data center, and wonder what we wrote. The evidence is gone. The question remains. And the question, did the Olmec invent writing in the Americas, may stand unanswered for as long as there are scholars to ask it. In the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City, in a gallery devoted to the Gulf Coast cultures of ancient Mesoamerica, there is a room filled with Olmec sculptures. The colossal heads gaze from their pedestals with expressions that have been variously described as serene, commanding, contemplative, and unknowable. They are portraits of rulers, men who held power over a civilization that was, for centuries, the most advanced in the Western Hemisphere. Their faces are specific, individual, recognizable as portraits of distinct human beings. They are not anonymous. They are named, or they were named, once, in a script that no living person can read. Somewhere in that room, or in a storage vault beneath it, or in a university laboratory or a museum storeroom in Veracruz or in Washington or in London, there may be objects that bear additional examples of the Olmec script. Objects that have been catalogued as decorated, or inscribed with unknown symbols, or bearing iconographic elements of uncertain significance, and that have not been recognized by the scholars who catalogued them as writing. The Cascajal Block was not recognized as writing for years after its discovery. How many other objects have been misidentified? How many Olmec inscriptions sit in museum storerooms, catalogued as decorative motifs, waiting for someone with the right training and the right insight to recognize them for what they are? The answer to the title question, what happened to the Olmec script, is this: it was lost, not to a single catastrophe, not to a definable act of destruction, but to the quiet, cumulative, implacable forces that consume everything that is not carved in stone. Tropical humidity, organic decay, the recycling of perishable materials, the deliberate destruction of monuments by the Olmec themselves, the indifferent processes of a living landscape that grows over, sinks beneath, and dissolves the traces of every human settlement within its reach. The Olmec script was lost because the Olmec lived in the jungle. It is as simple and as devastating as that. A civilization that had developed in the deserts of Egypt or the mountains of Iran would have left its writing on clay tablets and stone stelae that would have survived for millennia. The Olmec developed in the tropics. They wrote on bark, the bark rotted, the writing vanished, the colossal heads endure, the script does not. If the Olmec script is the ancestor of Mesoamerican writing, if the Maya, the Zapotec, and the other great literate civilizations of pre-Columbian America owe their writing to an Olmec original, then the loss of the Olmec script is a loss of the origin story of an entire hemisphere's literacy. We can read the Maya glyphs, we can partially understand the Zapotec inscriptions, we can decipher the Aztec pictographic records, but we cannot read the text that may have started it all. The first writing in the Americas. The original experiment in making language visible and permanent, the moment when a human hand first pressed a symbol into stone and meant it to be read. That moment occurred, in all probability, in the hot, humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast, roughly 3,000 years ago. A craftsman held a piece of serpentine in one hand and an obsidian blade in the other. The craftsman carved a sign, an insect perhaps, or a maize cob, or a fish, or a shape that represented a sound that the craftsman could hear and that we cannot. The sign was the first in a sequence of 62. The sequence may have been a name, a prayer, a calendar, a record, a poem, or something else entirely. The craftsman finished the carving, set down the blade, and turned the block over in their hands. The signs were clear. The stone was smooth. The message was complete. 3,000 years later, the stone is in a museum. The signs are clear. The message is complete, and no one on earth can read it. The stone endures. The script is silent. the jungle grows, and the first words ever written in the Americas, carved by a hand that knew their meaning in a language that no one alive has ever heard, wait in their museum case for a reader who may never come. The stone is patient. It has been patient for 3,000 years. It can wait a little longer. But patience should not be confused with hope. The stone does not hope. The stone does not anticipate a reader. The stone does not know that it is the most important piece of carved serpentine in the history of the Western Hemisphere, the object on which the question of the origin of American writing rests, the single artifact that separates the hypothesis of Olmec literacy from the realm of pure speculation. The stone simply exists, as it has existed since a craftsman in the tropical lowlands of Veracruz shaped it, smoothed it, and carved into its surface the 62 symbols that have confounded every scholar who has examined them. The craftsman who carved those symbols is as anonymous as the symbols themselves. No name has been attached to the block, no portrait accompanies it, no biographical detail has survived. The craftsman is known only through the work of their hands, through the precise, confident incisions that form the 62 signs, each one the product of a skilled artisan who had mastered the demanding technique of carving detailed symbols into hard stone with brittle obsidian tools. The craftsman's identity has been consumed by the same forces that consumed the rest of the Olmec written record. The forces of time, environment, and the relentless recycling of organic materials in a tropical landscape. The stone preserves the work. It does not preserve the worker, but patience is not hope. The stone does not hope to be read. It does not know that it is unread. It does not know that the signs on its surface once meant something, and that the meaning has been lost. It is stone. It endures because enduring is what stone does. The meaning it carried was human, born in a human mind, expressed by a human hand, intended for human eyes. And the human chain that sustained the meaning, the chain of writers and readers, of teachers and students, of a community that shared a script and a language and a world, is broken. Broken not by violence, as with Rongorongo, not by conquest, as with Linear A, but by time, by change, by the quiet transformation of a civilization that outgrew its own beginnings and left them behind in the tropical soil of the Gulf Coast. The loss of the Olmec script is, in a sense, the gentlest of the losses we have examined. There was no burning, there was no slave raid, there was no missionary with a torch. There was only change, the slow, natural, perhaps inevitable process by which one culture gives way to another, one script is replaced by its successor, one language evolves into something new. The Olmec did not lose their writing to an enemy. They lost it to their own descendants, to the later cultures that inherited their innovations, adapted them, transformed them beyond recognition, and eventually forgot where they came from. This is the most common form of knowledge loss in human history. It is not the dramatic form, the burning library, the sacked city, the murdered scholars. It is the everyday form, the form that operates not through catastrophe but through the ordinary processes of cultural change. A technique is modified, a practice is updated, a word falls out of use, a script is replaced by a newer, better one. Each individual change is small, reasonable, and progressive, but the cumulative effect, over centuries, is total. The original is forgotten, the starting point is erased, and the chain of knowledge that once connected the present to the past is broken, link by link, until the past is unreachable. The Olmec script was lost this way, not in a moment of destruction, but in a millennium of transformation. The Cascajal Block is the last visible trace of the starting point, the first word, the original inscription, the beginning of a tradition that would transform an entire hemisphere. The tradition continued. The beginning was forgotten, and the Cascajal Block, small and silent and impossibly old, sits in its storage vault, bearing the first words ever written in the Americas. Words that no one alive can read, words that may never be read, words that mark the beginning of a story whose first chapter has been permanently lost. Every Mesoamerican script that followed the Olmec, every Maya codex, every Zapotec stela, every Mixtec genealogy, every Aztec tribute list, may owe its existence to the moment when an Olmec craftsman first pressed a sign into stone and meant it to be read. That moment was the birth of literacy in the Western Hemisphere. That moment was the beginning of everything. and that moment is represented in the entire archaeological record of the Americas by 62 signs on a single block of serpentine pulled from a pile of rubble by road workers who did not know what they had found. The first words of the Americas are silent. The stone that carries them endures, and the jungle, which consumed everything else the Olmec wrote, continues to grow, patient, indifferent and green, over the place where the words were born. The Cascajal Block is small enough to hold in 2 hands. It weighs roughly 12 kilograms, heavy for its size, because serpentine is a dense stone. Holding it, if one could hold it, which the museum authorities do not permit, you would feel the weight of the stone and the weight of the meaning it carries. Both are substantial. The stone is heavy because it is dense. The meaning is heavy because it is irreplaceable. 62 signs, 28 distinct symbols. The first words ever written in the Western Hemisphere, carved by a hand that knew what it was writing, in a language that no one alive has ever spoken, for a purpose that no one alive can identify. The hand is gone, the language is gone, the purpose is gone, the stone remains. And the signs on the stone, small, precise, pictographic and abstract, arranged in rows like a page from a book that no one can read. Wait with the patience of stone for a reader who may never come. The wait has lasted 3,000 years. It may last 3,000 more. The stone does not care. Stone is patient. Stone is indifferent. Stone endures. The knowledge that gave the signs their meaning was not made of stone. It was made of something far more fragile, of human minds, human voices, human traditions transmitted from generation to generation through the perishable medium of living memory. The stone endured. The memory did not. And the gap between the enduring stone and the vanished memory is the gap at the center of the Olmec story, and at the center of every story about the things that human beings create and the things that human beings forget. The signs are there, the meaning is gone, the jungle grows, the stone waits.